to hear stories and to tell stories. I think it's really our strongest need. It's the thing that we won't do without. And we continually tell stories ourselves, and we continually long to hear them. And I think that it's important to remember that this has been true of all people at all times. It's not something which is, right now, at the present time, a lot of people think that storytelling is either a sort of sentimental, leftover from the 60s indulgence, or else something that is for very sort of commonplace people. I think that some of you know the direction of the short story in recent times, whose whole aim is not to tell a story. You're supposed to make up the story after you've read it, and their aim is to present something like a mood or something like the shadow of an experience, and then you are supposed to fill in this. And actually to make a story with a beginning and a middle and an end seems to people, a great many people at the present time, in whatever this is. I never know what to call the group that we are in, pretty much. And so I started calling them Cosa Nostra, because it is a kind of, it's a group. And they're not intelligent. It isn't devoted to intelligence. It isn't devoted to the arts. It's just some kind of a group. I don't know what it is, and I never have been able to say. But in our group, there's a certain way of looking down on telling a story. And that yet, of course, at the same time, you see, we passionately long for them. So all that we do is sort of displace this desire from, say, the short story itself into any number of other things, just actually our own creation, or into gossip, or into television, movies, whatever it may be. So the desire is always there, and it's there. You see, the thing that fascinates me is that it's for everybody. It's for little tiny children, it's for ancient people, it's for people in absolutely primitive societies, absolutely developed societies, wherever. And I don't think there's any other art that you could say that about, really, to the same degree, and really to recognize exactly the same kind of qualities. So the fact that at the present time visual art is really scared to tell a story, or has no story to tell, or is some way frightened of it, is one of the things which I believe is very difficult, makes it very difficult for the artist at the present time. The reason for that is because when a story occurs, when a story has a power and comes into existence as a spoken story, there is, and it is believed widely, there's an enormous rush of expression. There's just a tremendous outburst of the visual arts to tell that story. And of course, in almost all the time, it's been a story of heroes, it's been a story of sacred figures, it's been a story of miracle, of the astonishing powers that are not ordinary powers, and then it's moved all through the whole of life. So that whenever the story grasps the imagination of people, it releases an enormous, really like a great wellspring of creativity, of the making of illustrations for it. And I think we all have that to some extent. We all know something about it because, well, I suppose that if you are a painter or a writer or a musician, there's a moment when it becomes clear to you what you should do. And that moment is the most refreshing. You see, then you immediately pour out an enormous great production of whatever it may be, of pictures or of music or whatever. But it's when the story that is your story that you want to tell comes to you, then there's no question of any kind of blocking or no difficulty about it. And exactly the same thing is true in whole societies. Now, I want to talk to you tonight about India, and I always hesitate to tell you something because it's just such a mystery, that I don't want to puzzle your brains with it any more than I like to puzzle my own brains with it, but we've got to face it. And that is that India, for about 1,000 years, left no mark in the visual arts. Actually, more than 1,000 years. You see, it's as mysterious as the disappearance of the dinosaur, and it's just as difficult to explain, because the world of India around the 3rd millennia BC, around 2600, to about 15 or even earlier, 100, was a world of high civilization. It was a world of great cities, and it was a world of great, the production of very abundant works of art. Now, we wouldn't know that if that city hadn't been dug up in fairly recent times. The cities of two of them, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. But they are so amazing, and the things which are produced are so extraordinary. And then absolute silence, nothing, for 1,000 years. And you see what was happening. See, it's just impossible to say. And then when it takes up again, it's exactly the way it was. Now you see, that's not possible, is it? But it happens. It happens, that's all. Let's look at some slides, and you can see what I'm talking about quite easily and clearly, I think. As soon as it gets in focus, anyway. Not until then. These are artifacts, things which were dug up from Harappa, and as you can see, they represent something which is going to be true of Indian art all the time. That is, that it uses the human body, that it delights in the human body, and that it is marvelously adept at using it. And these figures, and this is just a tiny handful of the many figures that are left from there. And let's look at the next one, which is really, well, you can't see the whole thing on. Can you get that down a little bit just so we can see the top of it too? Because this is a very sophisticated handling of the body. It's a very knowledgeable, there's nothing archaic about it. There's nothing which is hesitant about it. It implies that there are a great many more, that we just don't have them. Because you don't get to this degree of skill just by some immediate kind of thing. It comes through the developing of that skill. Now look at it carefully, and then look at the next one. There's 1,000 years between those two. And almost nothing to show why this was still preserved, this vision, where it was preserved, whether it was preserved or whether it simply is recreated. But there they are. It's the same conception of a certain sort of softness of the body, very unlike the Greek conception. No interest in the developing of muscles or something, just of the roundness and softness of the body. And also, of course, this very great skill at the handling of stone, of being able to carve in this way. Let's look at the next one. Once this reappears, then there's an outburst of it. There are great numbers of things. And one of the things that happens, you see, the thing that really brings us about is the introduction of Buddhism. And this was brought about by an emperor, Emperor Asoka, in the 3rd century BC. Now, Buddha himself lived in the 6th century BC and was, of course, as you know, one of the great figures of the world, born and active in the 6th century BC, when there was really just a sort of tremendous turnover of the ideas of human beings, or the presentation of those ideas everywhere in the world. And the Buddha's religion, or Buddha's revelation, came in an already very active society, a society very rich in its religious understanding, its religious ideas. The thing that we call the Vedas, the Vedic religion, which is very ancient, at least from 2000 BC, was at that time in the 6th century undergoing a great many curious sort of heresies and alterations. It was really just a boiling kind of world of religious imagination, the religious instinct. And among those, the many people who were active at that time, Prince Siddhartha, Buddha, is of course one whose revelation spread over the world in a very short time. But there wasn't any representation of it until the 3rd century BC with Ashoka, who was a convert to Buddhism. He stands very much the same way as Constantine does, and he was it changed his whole life, and he put inscriptions and columns. There's this column with the lions all around, telling about his conversion and telling about the change that Buddhism brought in his own life, so that he could no longer take life, for instance. He could no longer indulge himself as he had been able to do, and he'd been really a very cruel person. But this was a total change in his whole life and his nature, and he converted, or he insisted on Buddhism becoming the state religion. Not that the other religions were persecuted, but it became the center religion. And let's look at the next slide. And this brought with it this tremendous outburst of sculpture, again, of that kind of stone sculpture, beautifully carved, very intricate and beautiful carving. Again, that same soft body that you saw from Harappa. And let's look at the next one. And that becomes the pattern for 400 years. So that there's 400 years at least between the one that you saw just before and this one. But they could have been carved really by the same person almost. So that it sets a way of doing, or a comprehensive way of doing, that then releases a tremendous number of images into the world. Let's look at the next one, because it's such a beautiful detail of this head. Now, some people say that this happened because of Alexander's conquest, that the Indian world was made aware, made very conscious of the use of stone sculpture, because every place that Alexander the Great went, he had images of himself made. And he traveled with sculptors, and he set up images of himself as Apollo wherever he conquered anyone. So that people think that perhaps this is one of the reasons, but the thing which really in a way alters that idea is the similarity of this to the very early Indian things. But the magnificence of that carving, and the way that this has now become something which is obviously Buddhist. It is the Buddha Maitreya, the Buddha who is to come, but he has all the marks of Buddha, except that he doesn't look like him, partly because of the mustache. Let's look at the next slide. And then this kind of image, the image of a man and woman, which is as ancient in Indian imagination as any single image. The way that the Indian imagination, when it devotes itself to religion, immediately sees the female aspect of the divinity, no matter what divinity it is. His Shakti, or female energy, immediately exists with him. There's never any separation of them. So that this becomes one of the continuous themes in Indian art. And you will see it go from all through Buddhism. And this is the extraordinary thing, because let's look at the next slide, because you see, Buddhism is essentially the utterance of Buddha, as far as we know what they are, was essentially an utterance about the sorrowfulness and the pain and the transience of life. That because these threefold truths cannot be denied, that life is essentially sorrowful, it's essentially painful, and it's essentially transient. And that the fourth truth is to become detached from it, non-attachment. Now this is Buddha's revelation. And his revelation then is accompanied by the conviction that there's no escape from this. There's not anything that you can do about it in terms of immediate action. What you must do is follow the Eightfold Path, which is generally the ethical path of right resolve and right speech and right conduct and right livelihood and right meditation, right thinking, all of these which are really ultimately ethical beliefs. Those will finally enable you to escape life itself and enter nirvana. But you see, it's a very difficult and very austere belief. And the whole nature of Indian religious imagination is really unable to hold on to that. It cannot remain that sorrowful. It cannot remain that pain, that sense of the pain of life. There's something which is too abundant, too buoyant, too joyous, that you can see in every single thing that was ever carved in India. So that what happens is that this religion immediately absorbs the most extraordinary variety of experiences and thoughts and stories from the whole Indian world. And instead of remaining that kind of sorrowful and painful and transient vision, it becomes a vision of joy and compassion and delight. Now this is an extraordinary transformation, and it is a thing which really holds the Indian imagination throughout the whole domain of Buddhism. And the narrower conviction, the slower, softer world that is in India, really, finally, is entirely absorbed by what came before, by the Hinduism, so that you can see that happen. But it's something which you couldn't imagine not happening, because it is so it's so far from that quality of abundance. I think when you see this, for instance, you see Buddhism in this enlarged form, which really takes in all of the animals, takes in all the spirits of the air, takes in all of the divinities that have ever been mentioned. It takes in everything. The quality of the imagination that makes anything as rich as this. This is a gateway to one of the things which are really memorial sites from Buddha's life. This is at Sanche, and it is what's called a stupa, which is just a mound of earth covered with carvings that contains some of the relics of Buddha. So, and this is one of the great ones. It was built over quite a long period of time, at least the 2nd century BC and 1st and 2nd century AD, at least maybe 400 years. But you see this quality of richness, this kind of voluptuousness and prolixity of the imagination that doesn't want to see anything which is not decorated, not ornamented, not richly carved, not full of all kinds of life. You cannot feel the austerity of Buddhist thought. And it really has been, to a great extent, simply absorbed by this time, see, by the 1st century. It's been absorbed into the whole Indian imagination, the whole Indian spiritual life. Let's look at the next slide. You have some. You see this? But this is what I mean by the explosion of images that happens when some story takes over the imagination of a whole people. It simply means that there's never enough room to carve enough things to convey and to keep on telling over and over and over the same story, the same marvelous, magical story. Now, the Buddha's life was a perfect, really absolutely an irresistible life for storytelling, for telling about it, because he was born into a very wealthy, a great family, a very powerful family. His father was a king, and he was the prince, the heir and prince. And his father was told when Buddha was born that he would either be a great ruler of the world or he would be a great ascetic. And the father was afraid that he would be a leader in the religious world instead of in the political world. So he decided to, as I'm sure you know, enclose the young prince and prevent him from seeing anything. And he lived, first up till he was 30 years old, he lived a life of absolute indulgence, great richness, great power, with wonderful stories about him. He was married, he had a child, he had everything that he could possibly want. And his life was the life of a young prince. But something meant to him more than that, and he didn't know what. And he said to his father, I must go out and see the world. His father said, all right. And then his father set up, you see, this marvelous thing. He made an artificial world. He had everybody who had any kind of difficulty or ugliness or sickness or poverty hide. And then Buddha went out, you see, and went into this wonderful world. It was lined with beautiful young people scattering flowers, and everything looked absolutely lovely. But the gods didn't want. And you see, imagine them being introduced into Buddha's life. But they were by this time. They didn't want Buddha to do this. So one of them took the form of a person who was old. And young Prince Siddhartha saw this person, and was horrified. He said, what on earth has happened to this person? And people were they didn't like to tell him that it happens to everybody. So they sort of hesitated, and then they said, well, that happens. So he went back and was sorrowful about that. The next time he went out, these are called the 4 encounters, he went out and he encountered someone who was sick. Then he encountered someone who was dead. And then he encountered a hermit, a beggar. And this, of course, transformed his life. So that all of his life as the prince, which was wonderfully illustrated by stories, you know, how he was the greatest horseman, he was the greatest archer, he was the greatest lover, he was the greatest, handsomest person, the wisest, and so on. All of this becomes meaningless to him, and he has to leave. So he goes, and again the gods help him. He goes at night because he wakes up and he sees all the people sleeping, and they look so awful. They're sprawling around, their mouths are open, they're drooling, and they're snoring, and they're scratching, and they're, everything that his father tried to hide from him, our mortality, our ugliness, our reality of our physical selves, he suddenly had to see. So he left. And he left on his favorite horse, Kantaka, with his favorite groom, Chandraka. And then the marvelous thing, it's so wonderful, you see, because it's so impossible. All of the great things of Buddha's life, his horse, his groom, his wife, the tree under which he was enlightened, all of these were born on the same day. Now, you know that a tree, a horse, and he's already 30, but it's still, it's the idea that all these things came into existence for him at once, as a work of art, you see, not as any kind of reality. And then, of course, he goes out and he cuts off the top, all of his hair, which leaves him a top knot, and throws it back and all of his clothes and jewels, and goes into the forest, and then is there for 40 years, and not really, but that's what it says. And all of the time he's trying to find out what's the meaning of life, trying to be enlightened. And he tries terrible ascetic punishments to himself. He lives absolutely without food. He subjects himself to terrible physical anguishes and sufferings, and nothing comes of it. He's with 5 disciples because he's such an extraordinary ascetic. He can go for 6 months without eating and without drinking, that they follow him for that. And then he goes and he decides this doesn't mean anything. It's not getting anywhere. So then they leave him in despair, and he goes and decides to sit under a Bodhi tree until he's enlightened. And he sits there, and he is finally enlightened. But before that, he's tempted by Mara, which is the god of the underworld, and his beautiful daughters. He's tempted by power. He's tempted by everything. He's told that his father's kingdom has been overthrown. It's not true. He's told that his son is in terrible difficulty, but he does nothing but sit there. And finally, he is enlightened. And his enlightenment is this fourfold truth. And his enlightenment is that any kind of excessive asceticism, excessive voluptuousness, anything of that nature, it leads to despair and death and rebirth. Now, this is such an extraordinary idea, because if there ever was an excessive country in the world, it's India, and an excessive imagination, with such a whole richness and outpouring and constant invention and augmentation of ideas and of images, it is India. And for anything asking for the middle way, asking for abandoning the extremes. So it is, of course, swallowed. Now, the images, as you can see here, elephants and lions, all of the animals of the world that have always been a part of the Indian imagination and a part of the Indian, with gods taking their forms, having avatars in these various forms, and with the animals themselves talking and reaching all kinds of spiritual heights. All of these things have to come back, you see, and they do. Let's look at the next one. And this same wonderful feeling for the voluptuous beauty of women. Now, this is an apsara, and the apsaras were again brought back from the earlier world to act as really as temptations, so that if you were very, very virtuous, the gods might send an apsara to you. And this wonderful story of one who was sent to a man who was absolutely reached great heights of holiness, and he fell madly in love with her, and she said, "I'll live with you, but as long as you never question me, never ask me why I did something or what, nothing." And so he did, and at the end of a year she had a child. She took it out and drowned it, and he said nothing. And at the end of the next year she did the same thing, and at the end of the 3rd year he said, "Darling, must you?" And she said, "You dreadful thing, you questioned me and flew away." She's a very stern kind of a temptress indeed. And of course, well, you know, what would Buddha have thought of it? It's such a marvelous adumbration. But then there are endless, there are always apsaras as part of the beautiful ornamentation. The woman in the tree, it's always that sense of women being a part of nature and being a part of very beautiful, rich, sumptuous nature. Let's look at the next slide. Now, the stories of Buddha's life, of course, have made a wonderful whole outburst of these visions of the miraculous. This is the conception. He was his mother, who is called Maya, which means illusion, was sleeping and dreamt that a white elephant came and entered her side. Now, this is a very early representation of it, about the 1st century BC. There she is asleep with her handmaiden watching, and this enormous elephant. Let's look at the next one. Because here you see you have the thing that I spoke about last time, and that makes the story so valuable to the artist, because it can never really be told except in words, but it can always be interpreted. And the artist has to interpret it. And his interpretation is what makes the thing what it is. The story people know. Now, of course, as soon as people don't know the story, it becomes very mysterious. You don't know what on earth's going on. But as long as you do know the story, then the artist has the power to interpret it for you with new depths, with new comprehension, with new subtlety, all kinds of things. And so that the story can be told again and again. See what a different elephant this is. It's really a little spirit elephant, a dream elephant that's entering her side. And let's look at the next one. And there she is with a very large elephant, not even entering, just peering at her. And let's look at the next one. Because then what? She starts to go home to have her child in her own family's palace. But on the way, in the Lumbrini Gardens, she feels that she's going to have the child. She stands under the tree, exactly as the apsara, you see, with one hand up over the tree, and Buddha is born from her side, without any pain, and with, furthermore, a whole endless flowers falling all around him, and stars and everything. The whole world rejoices, you see. And he's accompanied in this image with all of the different gods who are present. There's Indra and all the different Aruna, all of the different great gods of the Hindu pantheon. So, and here he is coming from her side. Let's look at the next slide. There he is having his first bath. Again, he's accompanied by gods. You see, and I think you can see that this is one of the reasons that people think that the influence of Alexander the Great, because these things look almost exactly like Roman carving of the same time, well, really, actually of the same time. The way the drapery is done, and so on. Let's look at the next slide. Now, here he is leaving the palace after his encounters, and there are many pictures of the encounters, of course. And you see how the gods have gotten little demon figures to hold the horse's hoofs so that nobody can hear him leave. That's what's going on here. And otherwise, again, you'd be quite mystified as what they're doing. But they're holding his hoofs. And then he's accompanied again by all of these same divinities, and furthermore, all previous Buddhas with their top knots, and Buddhas that are to come. Let's look at the next. So that nothing you see that happens in any kind of ordinary way. It happens in an extraordinary way. And because of that, it can be illuminated and it can be amplified by the artist himself. Now, this is the temptation of Buddha. And you see, by this time, you begin to have a desire to show what actually, what Buddha looks like, but not the ability to make what is finally a satisfactory figure. But you begin to have the recognition that there are certain attitudes, or mudras as they're called, a teaching mudra. This is the earth-touching mudra. Because when Buddha was tempted, the way that he answered the temptation was to touch the ground. And the ground was his. And the ground, therefore, threw off the temptation. Let's look at the next one. And there he is on the lotus throne, when he is actually getting a new revelation of the meaning of the world. And he's surrounded then by, again, all kinds of divinities. Let's look at the next one. He goes back then to to convert the people that had left him, the 5 Cassiapa brothers, and here he is converting them. Let's look at the next one, because these are wonderful stories of his life. And finally he comes back to these Kapilavattsa where he was born, and this is the image of that. But you see, in this artist won't even represent Buddha. And Buddha is this tree over here. See, because that's the Bodhi tree, and it's the tree under which he sat when he was enlightened. So instead of representing Buddha, because there's the feeling, certainly in the 1st century BC, in the 1st century AD, the feeling was that Buddha couldn't be represented. That there was no way you could actually represent him. And that his power was so extraordinary and his appearance so transparent, really, that he couldn't be shown. So he's shown by not being shown. So he's shown as the Bodhi tree, and you see they're all coming to greet him. Again, all the gods, the ancient Hindu gods, are up above watching this. Let's look at the next one. And when he comes there, he converts his father, he converts his wife, and his brother, his half-brother, Ananda, is about to be married, and to the most beautiful girl in the kingdom. And Buddha hands him his begging bowl, and Ananda tries to give it back to him, filled with food, and he won't take it. So he walks away, and Ananda follows him, trying to give the bowl back, until he gets clear into the forest where Buddha has his abode and his monks, and then he tells him that he shouldn't get married, and he shouldn't possibly. He does a marvelous miracle. He shows Ananda a monkey, and he says, "Is the woman that you love as beautiful as this?" And Ananda's furious and says, "Of course, she's 1,000,000 times more beautiful than that." And then he sends him up to the highest heavens, which are full of beautiful women. And he says, "Is your beloved as beautiful as this?" And he says, "Not quite." And he says, "Well, if you will follow me, you will be translated into that heaven." And then he takes him down to hell and says, "If, however, you do that, you will plunge into hell." So poor Ananda, whirled through all these cosmoses and through these terrible experiences, is totally converted and becomes his favorite disciple. And this is, see, there he is, refusing to take the begging bowl from him. Let's look at the next one. He also has an enemy who was part of the palace also, and who spends his time trying to kill him. And in this instance, you have again that business of simultaneity, that the artist has to show the prominent figures twice in order to convey what's actually happening. And of course, it doesn't then convey it unless you already know the story. But he loosed on Buddha, see over on the extreme right, that's where Buddha is, an elephant who was drunk. He got the elephant drunk and turned him loose where Buddha was going to be. And everybody ran because he was very dangerous, and hid and ran crying away. But when the elephant got to Buddha, he was overcome by Buddha's spiritual power and fell on his knees. Another time, Devadatta rolled a boulder down where Buddha was sitting, and the boulder split in two when it got to him instead of hitting him. So that all of these miracles were wonderful stories for people. Let's look at the next slide. And here's another one about the monkeys came because, again, you see how the animals come in inevitably. The monkeys came to give honey to Buddha, and they brought him honey, and he took it. He brought him as an offering. Now there's Buddha again as the tree. And the monkeys are showing him the honey. They were so delighted, the monkey king that gave it to him was so delighted that Buddha would take it, that he began to do wonderful tricks, and he fell and broke his neck and was instantly translated to heaven. So the monkey, by this devotion, let's look at the next slide, was really saved. Another of the things which Buddha did, and which is constantly represented, and again would be absolutely meaningless to you, and I'm sure that many of you have already seen this picture, which is a miracle of Sravasti, when the Buddha is duplicated, endlessly multiplied, until he fills the whole universe. And so this is the image of these 10,000 Buddhas, as it's called. Let's look at the next one. Now, when Buddha comes to die, it's the parinirvana, as it's called, which is to enter nirvana. Here again, this is an early representation of it, and Buddha is represented by a stupa. And in fact, just like the one at Sanchi, with the gates around it and the railings around it. And all of his followers there are distraught and crying and weeping, and people, the gods, are delighted because he has now entered nirvana. So he lies down on his right side and enters nirvana. Let's look at the next sign, because now, same story, but now the artist can show that he is lying down and can show the despair of all the people who followed him, tearing their hair, raising their hands to heaven, crying. Let's look at the next one. His last words were, "Work out your salvation with diligence." It's a wonderful contrast to the remark of Jesus, "Work out your salvation in fear and trembling." Now, immediately after his death, there's a tremendous war over who gets his relics, because he's burned, his body is burned. It wouldn't burn for a while because the fire couldn't bear to burn him. And then finally the fire decided that he must burn him, and so it lighted all by itself and burned him, and what his remains looked like was a pile of pearls. And then they were divided and given to people, but there was a battle, literally a war, to get possession of them, and this is that war of the relics. Let's look at the next slide. Now, as I said to you before, one of the marvelous things about the Buddha story, and one that makes it even richer and calls on even more of that kind of sumptuous imagination of the Indian artist, is the so-called Jataka tales, the stories of his life before he was Buddha. And almost all of them have to do with extraordinary generosity, extraordinary willingness to sacrifice. And this is the Visvantara Jataka, a story of Buddha when he was a prince, who with his wife and his children set out on a voyage. People asked him for alms. He gave them alms. If he had no alms, he gave them his clothes. He gave them his wife's clothes. He gave them his children's clothes. Finally, he gave them his children. Finally, he gave them his wife. Finally, he gave them himself. And at that point, the gods took pity on him and restored everything to him. So it's one of the great stories of this kind of generosity. You can see him without any clothes on several places, and in all of these problems and trials. Let's look at the next one. Then there's another story of a monkey, Mama Kapi Jataka, a monkey who gives his life to his tribe because there was a terrible forest fire, and the only way they can get beyond it is crossing a river. There's no way they can cross the river. So the monkey holds on with his tail to one side of the river, leaps to the other side, and makes a bridge for them to pass over. And they all pass over it, and then at the very end, his back is broken, and he also goes to heaven. Let's look at the next slide. Down below you have the worship of Buddha. There's another marvelous Jataka tale of the six-tusked elephant. It's because it's so extraordinary in the length of time, because one of the things that makes for this kind of sumptuousness, this kind of richness, is the feeling that there isn't any time, that there's just endless time, and that you're in a way conscious during the time, and yet you can enjoy it. The whole feeling of endlessness is part of the joy of it. And Buddha was a six-tusked white elephant, and he had two beautiful elephant ladies in his harem. One of them was jealous of the other one, prayed to the gods that she should be reincarnated as a queen in the country where he lived, where the elephant was. And this happened. She was reincarnated. She was a queen. She said to the king, "There's a six-tusked white elephant in the forest. You should have it." And so the king went out, kills the elephant, and she is, then you'll be glad to know, she's overcome with the cruelty and dreadfulness of her life, and sinks into despair, dies right away. But the length of time, you see, that it takes for this is quite extraordinary, and does recognize a kind of necessity of whatever happens that makes it a particularly Indian idea. Let's look at the next one. Well, that's upside down. Let's look at the next one. Maybe you could fix that one while we look at the next one, because here is this is again the great problem of what should Buddha look like? What should he actually resemble? And it's much easier to have him represented by a symbol, so that lasts quite a long time. And this is the first sermon of Buddha, and the only way that you can tell is he sets into motion the wheel of the law, and that's the wheel of the law. And this happens in the deer park, and those are deer down below, and his followers among the deer. So that is the first sermon, and it's the first sermon after his enlightenment. Let's look at the next one. Now, when Buddha is first represented, there's still a very strong Western quality. First of all, the body is very physically, very solid, very substantial, heavy even, and as late Roman work was. And the drapery has gotten stylized in a much more linear way, much thinner, lighter. Let's look at the next slide. And here you have one of those extraordinary moments, I think, which occur in the history of art, when two things come together that are unlike, but they join and refresh each other. And there's still something of the Apollo, something of a kind of Greek ideal in this face, and yet it has become transformed into something else, but into something that really it's not going to last. It's not going to be the thing which is the final thing. It's this moment, a curious, eclectic moment, when these two disparate visions come together and can fertilize each other, can make each one more marvelous, because this has a quality of dream and a quality of a curious kind of compassion and understanding that no Greek figure ever has. And it also hasn't yet that quality of absolute withdrawal that will be finally the look of the Buddha figures. So it's just a moment, and it occurs in several heads, such as this one, which were undoubtedly broken off of whole figures. Let's look at the next slide. Because this is the direction, you see. This will be what it will be, will finally be the satisfactory image of Buddha. It's an image which is not no quality of muscle. It's what's called a lion body, very wide shoulders, and it has almost no sexuality to it. It has a very curious kind of as though the body were really moving away, exactly as the drapery. You see, the drapery is turned into something which is like a veil. It's not like that heavy, earthy sense of actual material that you had before. And it begins, of course, to have all of the established and conventional ways of sitting with the feet crossed this way. And let's look at the next slide. And again with hands, you see there's another one of the same kind of, and this beautiful waterfall pattern becomes linear, becomes absolutely otherworldly. It's not a part of this world at all. Let's look at the next slide, and you see it more and more. And this is from another section of India, but it also, the body becomes almost, even though this is a substantial figure, it has something about it which is as withdrawn and as mysterious as the last one that you saw. And again, in a teaching attitude, let's look at the next one. Until you get at something like this, which you see is absolutely, it is the finished image, the finished Indian image. About the 6th century it occurs, 5th century and 6th century, in what is called the Guptan style. And here you see how, this is not a good slide, I'm sorry to say, because you can't really see the detail. It still has the very transparent drapery, but now the whole thing is absolutely turned inward. It's completely removed from the world. It's completely absorbed in right meditation, the meditation of ecstasy and joy. That is the result of the Eightfold Path, and it is all of the elaboration, all of that taste for sumptuousness and for richness and variety and a tremendous sort of prolixity of the imagination has been put into the halo, so that it's just the halo that has this. So you have a marvelous contrast between the delicacy and the absolute simplicity and disembodiment of the figure of Buddha against the magnificence of the halo itself. Let's look at the next slide. Again, beautiful details of it. And you begin to have more and more the invasion, really, of Hinduism, the invasion of ideas. It's almost impossible for people to accept the austerity of all that we know that Buddha actually said. In the first place, there are many times when we doubt whether life is only sorrowful. There are certainly many times when we doubt that it's only painful. If it is so sorrowful and painful, it's not so bad that it's transient. So there is a way in which it's very hard, to stay with it, and it doesn't happen that they do in India. They really do not. And so one of the things which begins to seem, makes it necessary to change, is the idea that if Buddha is so compassionate, how could he desert the world and desert people by entering nirvana? And there develops an idea of what is called a bodhisattva. That is, a person who is able to be a Buddha, but refuses to enter nirvana because of his compassion on the world. And that his feeling for people's suffering and for the need that people have for that kind of loving attention is so great. His recognition of that is so great that he himself makes that great sacrifice of not entering nirvana and becomes instead what is called a bodhisattva and resides in a wonderful heaven. And in fact, there begin to be then, because India, one of the great things about India, fascinating, is its sense of mathematics. The things just absolutely, they just multiply. There are 26 different heavens in only one scale of heaven. Then above that, there's something like 10 more. So that there's a feeling of abundance, you see, there's never any kind of scarcity, never any kind of austerity at all, either in their religious imagination or in their vision. And so the bodhisattvas naturally begin to be a whole lot more attractive. And then they begin to take on all kinds of actual personalities, stories, names. This is one who then is carried to China and to Japan. Interestingly enough, becomes female, becomes the Kuan Yin figure. It's Avalokiteshvara, and he's one of the great bodhisattvas. And he becomes, because you see, he is so compassionate, he's so tender, he's so loving, that he just naturally is transformed into a woman when he moves out of India, which is very soon. Because really by the end of the 6th century A.D., Buddhism has really been reabsorbed. And there is a period then when there is not much sculpture of any kind. Let's look at the next slide. And then by the year 1000, 1100, 1300, all of this great richness of their imagination, all of this extraordinary ability to carve and to endlessly prefigure and see and create image after image, story after story, returns because Hinduism becomes the religion. And with it, the most extraordinary stories that have ever been told. But the style remains almost the same. You would think this was a Buddha, but it isn't. It's a Hindu god, goddess actually. But it has the same qualities. Its vision is the same kind of vision. And it becomes a part, let's look at the next slide, of what is the most exuberant carvings that have ever existed. In a way, it's a kind of parallel of what happens in Christianity. Because Christianity reaches its great expression of the meaning of the Christian story in perhaps the 13th century. Most people would agree. And then there is a return to the classical world for the images and for the stories. And exactly the same thing happens. You see, it goes back again to its origins. And its origins way past, exactly as the classical world is way before Christianity, in terms of the Greek classical world. It comes back and then again explodes in this endless images. Well, exactly the same thing happens, you see. Hindu images, Hindu deities take the same form, but take all kinds of marvelous stories. This is from Java. Let's look at the next slide. And again, you have the divinities, the male and female divinities, this wonderful quality that they have, and the joy that they have. I suppose there's nothing more, really more. Well, it's just exactly like the things at Sanchi. You see, it's the same kind of joyous sense of the physical world. And now it's following a Hindu pattern, but it is really essentially the same. Let's look at the next one. I think I have another one. This is the Ramayana. Some of you know the story, the wonderful story about Rama, who was one of the avatars of Vishnu. With the monkeys that helped him and the wicked king that tried to destroy him. And let's look at the next one. Even in the late Buddhist world, when you have the paintings in the caves, the Buddhist caves, you begin to have that fusion. And many of the images are the same. Again, the loving pair. This is the Visvantara Jataka. This is the king saying goodbye to his queen that they're going to start out on this journey, and he's comforting her for what will be finally the loss of everything that she has. So let's look at the next one. And there's another one, the same kind of theme. Wonderful, loving, and these figures, of course, are preserved because they were lost. They were in the caves of Ajanta. Let's look at the next one. And one of the most beautiful bodhisattvas, which I suppose one of the most beautiful images in Indian painting, is this image of Avalokiteshvara, holding a lotus with all of the quality of compassion, all of that kind of dreaminess, all of that refusal of that austerity of the world that true Buddhism or early Buddhism represented. I've a detail of that face. It's so beautiful. Let's look at the next one. This becomes what will really continually from this time on be the vision of the Bodhisattva. And you can see how easily it will move to China and Japan. Let's look at the next one. Now, that period in the year 1000, really 1300, is just the same kind of bursting of the same kind of imagination. And this is just one temple. Let's look at it close up. There are hundreds of them, almost all of them, and see, completely covered with figures. Just, There's never any end to them. There's no way in which you can feel that there's any drying up of this. Instead, and this goes on from this time on. It really goes on right. The same kind of prolixity of images goes on right into the 19th century and in a way into the 20th century. Let's look at the next. I have a detail of it. But you see, the temples are like some great, marvelous, organic thing. They're not like architecture. They're like something which really just grew out of the ground and was then grown into these wonderful patterns of, again, the human figure. The human figure over and over again, joyous, voluptuous, powerful, fleshy, absolutely delighting in itself and in the world. Let's look at the next one. Again, over and over, the Shiva and Parvati, the god and his Shakti, the god and his female energy, in whatever story it is, and sometimes simply that very image over and over and over again. Let's look at the next one. It's an inexhaustible image, of course, exactly as it is for human beings, an inexhaustible image. Let's look at the next one. And wonderful women doing, arranging themselves. So, let's look at the next one. Dressing and going. There's stories of Shiva and his female energy, Parvati, and always in all kinds, because that great power that the Indian romantic vision has, or vision of the diversity of the world, that means that not only does the divinity have his female aspect, but he has three aspects, and she has three aspects, so that she can be beautiful and also very deadly and dangerous. Let's look at the next one. And Shiva himself dances to create the world and dances to destroy it. Let's look at the next one. So that by now, these are the whole images of the world. There he is again with Parvati and his bull. So that from Harappa right down through all of the centuries, the bull occurs over and over, exactly as the lion does. Let's look at the next one. And these wonderful images. There's a woman putting on makeup. It's just such a... And the temples will be covered with these things. They were covered with them. Women combing their hair, putting on makeup, taking a bath, men riding horses, shooting arrows. The whole richness of the world and the whole excitement and fun of the world is just endlessly mirrored. Never getting tired of it, never finding it too old or weary a story. Let's look at the next one. And then this moves, of course, out of India entirely and moves someplace like to Tibet, where it's called Buddhism. Most of the divinities are Hindu. There are variations on Buddhist images. There are variations on Avalokiteshvara and on the other bodhisattvas, and there are variations on demons. But the whole style, now this is the Yabyum, the joining of male and female principle. That's one of the continuous images of Tibetan Buddhism. Let's look at, but how far? It couldn't be farther. Let's look at the next one. From the vision of Buddha. Couldn't be farther from the original, the only things that we really know about the real enlightenment was that this kind of excessiveness, this kind of violence is not the way to the heavens, or it's not the way to nirvana. This is Avalokiteshvara. Let's look at the next slide. And then the great concentration on death and on the ugliness and terror of the world. Something which is the dark aspect of the vision of Buddha, and something which is very far from his vision of joy and compassion and delight, simply in what is the true world, the world of the good and the virtue. Thank you very much. Oh, God, all tied up here. I don't know how I'm going to get out of it.
Mary, I'm Sharon Anderson. I'm a friend of Sue Struck.
Oh, how is Sue?
Fine. She couldn't come tonight.
Oh.